Hey everyone, we're going to look at interest groups today. When you look at the definition of an interest group, you'll see that it says it's an organized association that seeks to influence the policymaking process in the United States. And understand that when you look at the different type of interest groups that we have out there, the different types that we have, this is basically a left to right scale, a liberal to conservative scale of ideas, industries, and ideologies. So basically, you can find an interest group for almost anything out there. Good old James Madison warned us against factions, arguing that people sometimes work on behalf of their own self-interest rather than the common good. So what we have when we talk about interest groups is this attitude that we have an us versus them type of behavior, or a right versus wrong. Or even you could look at it from the perspective of working for the few rather than for the all. So we have this small portion of the population that's represented by an interest group, and their interests outweigh the interests of the nation as a whole. You have different types of interest groups, like I mentioned before, but there are public interest groups that exist that believe that they're working on behalf of the good of all Americans rather than just a significant few or just a small few in the population. We can go back to the early 1800s to see where interest groups came about. You can find interest groups in the mid-1800s were created around industry, and then its, let's say, opponent, labor, decided that they would also create their own interest groups as well. You had advocacy groups, which came about after World War I. You found them during the New Deal period, and you also found them during the Civil Rights era as well. Advocacy groups basically don't have local chapters, but they do have broad public goals that represent the nation as a whole. When you look at interest groups, the largest interest group organizations that we have out there are related to business. We also have professional associations, labor unions, and education groups. Over 50%, and when it keeps talking about these PowerPoints keep talking about Washington, we're talking about Washington, D.C. So over 50% of all of the active organizations that are in Washington, D.C., they happen to represent business interests. There is a significant portion of the population that is not represented. Like I said, everybody should be represented, but those who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum pretty much don't have any representation in government at all, outside of their representatives in government. So we ask ourselves, why do people join? There's always a reason for joining. It could be monetary, it could be a social incentive, it could be an idealist or a purposive incentive, that there's some kind of benefit that you get from joining these groups. Every interest group has an overall plan or a strategy, and within that strategy they use tactics to get things done. Inside strategies emphasize the direct personal encounters they have with public officials. Outside strategies involve activities that show popular support for a cause. The biggest thing that you need to know here is that money, numbers in an organization are very important to get what you want if you are an interest group. The more money you have, the more members you have in that organization, the more likely a member of government is going to listen to your plea and your cause. When we talk about lobbying, we're talking about actually being a salesman or a salesperson, saleswoman, trying to get what you want. So you're pushing your wares on the members of government to get your ideas put into public policy. So you're selling your one-sided belief to that member of Congress or a member of the Senate, or if it's at the state level, the state legislature. People who are really good at being lobbyists tend to be those who used to work in government, because after all, they know how government works. So they know what screws to turn in government because they used to be a part of that process. Most lobbyists, when you think about it, lobbyists sometimes are kind of frowned upon, and also members of government have tried to make sure that the people who are in interest groups, the lobbyists themselves, don't have so much influence. But this is kind of like, not really done 100% to favor, let's say, the public interest. Most lobbyists kind of do what they want within a certain parameter, but they do have some rules that they do have to follow when they are working with a member of Congress. It's very difficult to change the way government works. One of the reasons why is because of something called an iron triangle. It's a three-way mutually exclusive power relationship between interest groups, congressional committees, and executive agencies. And in the next slide, I'll show you how it all works. So let's say you want to create a new law. You're a new congressman coming into office. Most of the people that you're going to run into, the backlash that you're going to run into trying to change things, are also members of Congress themselves. And Congress works with interest groups because the interest group funds their political campaigns for the most part. An interest group works with the bureaucracy or the executive branch because they just want to make sure that there's no regulation that's taking place in government, or that they lobby support so that everybody understands that the budget is going to work out just fine. And then the executive branch works with Congress so that there's political support and there's a lot of handshaking going back and forth. So what you understand is that if you try to influence or try to change the way government works, you're pretty much not going to get anything in return. You're probably going to have your issue isn't going to go very far. When we talk about how interest groups influence, they also have something called a political action committee or a super PAC. A political action committee is a fundraising arm of an interest group. A super PAC is an organization that pretty much has unlimited ability to spend money on behalf of a political candidate running for office. And super PACs came about after the Supreme Court cases of Citizens United and SpeechNow.org. There's a lot of outside spending that takes place in political campaigns as well. And sometimes in the news you hear things about dark money, that money that is not disclosed, that are favoring one particular candidate over another. And let's understand that both Republicans and Democrats benefit from dark money, and they benefit from interest group support.